Okay, in this fairly brief chapter, we're going to touch on how to use the podcasting facilities in Wavelab. But before we get into that, I'd like to review just a little bit of the history and some fun numbers about podcasting in general. Okay, before we get into looking at exactly how to go about creating a podcast, I want to look at just a few numbers and statistics about the podcasting phenomena, and then a high-level overview of how the product actually works. So podcasting was initially introduced in 2003. That's when you had the first open source radio. Then the next year in 2004, the Guardian newspaper coins the term podcasting for the first time. That next year, iTunes incorporates it in version 4.9, and at that point, we're off to the races because it's now, obviously the term podcast refers to the early iPod, and Apple embraced it in 2005 and really lit the fuse. That same year, the term podcast is named Word of the Year. And by 2007, the world record for most downloads in 1 year is 261,000. Now, in 2007, Google also turned around and bought FeedBurner, which was a podcast provider at the time, for $100 million. Then by 2011, the world record for downloads in 1 year has gone from 250,000 to 60 million. By 2012, they say that 29% of all Americans have downloaded a podcast. 2013, Apple announces 1 billion subscribers globally. And in 2014, Apple buys the podcast app Swell for $30 million, which, one, says something about the staying power of podcasting. I also find it funny that Apple bought an app. Now, if we look at a few other fun numbers about this, the last statistic we have says there are about 29 million minutes of podcasts produced every year globally. The average length of that podcast is 22 minutes. They say that the average update period is weekly, and the most popular categories there start with music and end with management. There are 60,000 active podcast feeds on iTunes, which means at any given moment, there are 55 podcasts somewhere around the world being recorded. Now, that's all interesting sort of stage setting. Let's look at the actual mechanics of how this works. On the production side, of course, you have to start with your content. You have to have something to say, or your client does. Then you're going to capture the audio. And of course, podcasts started as audio only. Now they have video as well. So this could be audio or video, but you need to actually do the recording. And that's what most of us probably think of as the meat of the job, but that's really actually kind of just the first step. Then you're going to add all of the appropriate metadata to that. And finally, you need to upload it to a web host of some kind. Now, there are a million options out there. Here are half a dozen that are popular for podcasts. And look at the first one, SoundCloud. And of course, as we've already seen, Wavelab has as a native function the ability to export to Wavelab, or export to SoundCloud. There's a very tight relationship there, and it's a great first place to start. Now, SoundCloud, like all of these, is going to allow you one level of service for free. And then if you want more features, more storage, more hosting capability, you're going to pay up for that. So which solution is going to fit and at which level is going to be dictated largely by how complicated your podcast is, how much data it chews up, how many subscribers you have, things like that. But there are lots of options. The point here is it's not enough to just create the audio and to tag it. You have to park it somewhere that it's available 24 hours a day, because the other side of this equation is the aggregator software, which is probably more well known as a podcatcher. The most popular one in the world by far is iTunes. And you have others, Juice and Zune. The Androids use Double Twist and FeedBooks. Again, there are dozens. These are just a few of the big ones. My recommendation, if you're just dabbling in this, stick with SoundCloud and iTunes because everybody knows their way around those. But the key to the whole thing, what makes magic happen here, is the relationship between the host website and the podcatcher. And that relationship is known as an RSS subscription. RSS standing for Really Simple Syndication. And what that means is the aggregator software is going to come out and ping the host website periodically to see if there's any new stuff that's been uploaded. And if there is, it's going to download it automatically. And then when the end user plugs in their device or connects with their device, that update is added to their playlist, and suddenly you have new episodes. So the two things beyond Wavelab that you're going to need are a relationship with some sort of a hosting website and then an RSS subscription to the various podcatcher apps out there. So with that in mind, let's look at the step-by-step of how this actually lays out in Wavelab. Okay, so in order to begin from scratch with a podcast, you open the File tab, select New, and then navigate down to Create Podcast. and you'd get something that looks like this with a couple of empty tabs. Now, to keep things moving along here, I'm actually going to go back and open the this first file group here where we have a sample podcast loaded because it takes a long time to demonstrate all the typing and so forth. So essentially, this breaks down into two main areas. The top area of the screen is going to be largely the place to put your information about your episode or your feed, two very important terms there. And that's across three different tabs here. You have information at the top. Notice the bottom, which is where your actual stuff lives. That's where your episodes are going to stack up there. That's going to be the same across all these. So you have your episodes at the bottom and your information at the top. So the first in the main tab is pretty straightforward. You've got a title for your feed and then for your various episodes. And let's look at the bottom here. You'll notice the first item in this column is called feed, has a date, and it has a title. That's the title for your overall thing. Walt's awesome podcast. And then below that, you get into the different individual episodes. And what's important about that is the mechanics of the other two tabs are going to be different if you have feed selected down below versus episodes. So remember this Shift F1 technique that we looked at in the first chapter on how to call up the help arrow. This is particularly useful here because as you maneuver that over the different fields, it's going to tell you which ones are mandatory and which ones are not. And since when you turn this loose, it's all computer to computer. If you don't have every mandatory field filled in, it's going to squawk and kick back on you and so forth. So you can move down to each one of these and determine whether or not it's mandatory and so forth until you get the mechanics of the uploads and stuff under your hands. So this is the description here would be the overall description for your podcast in general. And this is probably the most critical thing to the whole bit. This is going to bring the link to your internet hosting site and so forth. And then we've got areas here. If you want to put a picture on this, you can assign a picture. Not one of my better days. So forth. Now, if we move over, we have an extra tab and an iTunes tab. And the iTunes tab only shows up if you enable this checkbox for the iTunes extension. And then you can give it all of the other pictures here, or other pieces of information, pictures and so forth down there. But in the extra tab itself, this is where you're going to have your email addresses and so forth. But check this out. If we switch, I'm on the feed item here, item 1. So this is all relative to the feed. If I switch to an episode down here, this data box changes a little bit. So if we go back up to the feed, you can see in addition to your copyright and category information, any associated domains, we have a frequency of update over here. And if I want to say, ignore doing this on Saturday or Sunday, or I don't want it to update between, say, midnight and 8 a.m., you can set all of those here, and that's going to take effect to your feed overall. Excuse me. Then on your individual episodes down here is where you're going to have additional titles and sources and so forth. So this is where we're going to establish all of the metadata associated with the audio file itself. And I guess that would be one thing to point out on the main tab here. I mentioned that this was absolutely vital because that's your link to the internet site. Right below it is another one that's absolutely vital. This is the actual audio file. So when you've gone ahead and recorded your audio and done your editing and so forth, and you've saved it, you're going to use the file browser here to go and actually find this thing. In this case, it's sitting out on the desktop as an MP3 file. And obviously, that's where you're going to pair the two up. But you'll notice what we're not doing here in the podcast workspace is we're not queuing up a mic and hitting the record button and talking about politics or health and science or whatever it is that your podcast is about. That's done in the audio editor elsewhere, saved and packaged in a file, usually an MP3, but they will accept others. And then you're using the podcast utility to attach metadata and to focus it all on the appropriate ins and outs and go. So the tab bar at the top up here in the ribbon, of course, the file tab never really changes, but we only have the one tab, and that's the edit tab. And the tools here are pretty straightforward. We've got episode tools, and this is where we can cut and copy entire episodes and move them around. So if I wanted episode 2 to move down, you can reorganize your list there. Then you've got a second group of 3 tools for FTP, or File Transfer Protocol. And this is a little bit older way of doing it. In the if you think of that slide with the hosting solution and then the aggregator, until recently, the only sorts of site that could accept or host podcasts would be a sort of an old school FTP site. And there certainly are plenty of those still out there. I think FeedBurner is still out there in some form, and that's what it does. But there are increasing numbers of hosted solutions, and actually using the SoundCloud thing, you probably won't use any FTP stuff. But you can call up your close this out real quick. You can call up this FTP setting site, and this is where you would go in and actually make your configuration changes for the host, the username, password, and so forth. Then a link to where your feed lives on your system and so forth, so that you can make sure to get the information off your computer and upload it to the FTP. And then once it's there, the aggregator or the podcatcher is going to ping it periodically to say any new episodes, and so forth. But that's what these 3 buttons in the middle are primarily doing, is you're going to configure your FTP settings, and then you can update, say, if we just wanted to update episode 1 or episode 2, you can do that and update it. And it's going to push back on me here a little bit. And then you have the option to update all of them if you were going through putting new information in and so forth. And then finally, on the podcast tab itself here, you can get into the actual XML, the extensible meta language code if you want to do that or need to do that. You've got some global options for resizing images and use on iTunes and things. And then finally, you've got the option here to view your finished podcast out there in the real world. And this is going to be taken down before you ever see this video, but all it is the narration from chapter 1 to prove it can be done. But one centralized control system for the whole thing. The only other aspect of this that I would point out is that with iTunes, even after you've sent your information to them, they go through a review process internally at Apple before your feed will actually go live, or your client's feed. And that can take anywhere from a few days to weeks, depending on workload and the nature of the content and so forth and so on. So if you do decide to go out there and start to engage with people and say, hey, I can get this done for you, and there's no financial reason you couldn't be a podcaster, make sure everybody's going to be looking at iTunes. The expectation there is make sure to set the expectation that can be anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of weeks before you're actually going to see it live out in the world. That's the first time. I think after that, subsequent updates post almost immediately. Those are the particulars, and like all the other tools we've looked at, you're just going to have to dive in and start working with them and have fun. And we'll come right back here for a wrap-up.